Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for coming to this session. My name's Katie. I'm a clinical fellow from the Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic, and I'm going to be presenting today with Lorenzo. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, Lorenzo Macaluso from the Center for EcoTechnology.
And we're going to be talking today about a project that we've been working on together over the past year, which is on the topic of organic waste bans and other strategies and policies that are related. And so to start with, I think we'll talk briefly about our organizations and how we came to work on this project together. As you've probably heard too many times during this conference, the Food Law and Policy Clinic is a clinical legal education program. So we were really interested in this topic from the policy side and have partnered with CET because of some of the complementary strengths. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about CET.
Sure. So as a nonprofit that has been working on wasted food for over 20 years and kind of being, I'll talk a little bit more about some examples later, but in the space of facilitating more activity in the marketplace between the policy space and what's actually happening in the marketplace. This was a great opportunity. As Katie says, we have worked together on a few other projects, and clearly the Harvard Food Law and Policy Clinic is the leader on policy space on this topic, and so we were excited to work on this project where it's really looking at those policies and how they're playing out in the marketplace. So we thought it was a really great sort of complementary project where we could work together and get the best possible outcome by combining those.
Yeah, definitely. And so today we're planning to release this toolkit in September. We'll talk about it a little bit more. But yeah, our plan is to really just walk you through some of the contents of this project that we're working on, what it contains, why we're producing this, and what the goals are, and also to hear a little bit from you all about your experiences, examples of some of the things we're talking about, and really try and make it a little bit conversational.
Great. So the process that we've gone through has been to engage a number of stakeholders across the country and conduct a lot of interviews and gather information and gather our own sort of collective organizational knowledge, and came up with a first draft of this over the winter, and then had shared that out and had a convening with a number of those stakeholders, about 15 or so, some of which are in the room, and kind of collected feedback from that process, and have done additional drafting, and we're able to share the executive summary today, I believe,
yes,
right?
Yes, I will have copies at the end of this presentation. I just realized that they are in the other room, so I'm going to send someone to get them. They're at the registration table. Thank you, Erica.
So they're coming, and then we're going to, as Katie said, release the final report in the fall.
So this slide provides both an overview of the contents of the toolkit and sort of an agenda for our presentation today. So the framework of the toolkit is really trying to help cities and states understand what are these policies, organic waste bans, or any of the other names they go by, why might they want to think about implementing one, what are the considerations in thinking about this, both in terms of how to structure a policy and then how it works in practice, and challenges, best practices, and learnings from other states and cities. So some of the key sections are costs and benefits. We review some of the impact analyses and CBA studies that other states have done, including Massachusetts and New York on its proposed law. We talk about the structure of the policies themselves and some considerations there. We talk about some of the barriers and challenges, such as enforcement and infrastructure development. And then we talk about a lot of the other external and contextual factors that really play a role in how an organic waste ban or related policy functions. So what are the education and technical assistance programs in the state? What are the funding opportunities, and what are other policies and programs like permitting and zoning and all of these other policies that actually play a role? So we are going to walk through a couple of key points and examples from each of these sections and take some pauses to ask questions in between. So just a brief overview of the legal landscape here. Currently, there are 5 states that have organic waste bans or mandatory recycling laws in place. They are for New England states, Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, as well as California. There are also several cities and municipalities, including Austin, Boulder, New York City, Seattle, and San Francisco. This is from the ReFed Policy Finder, so you can find this map if you want more information about each of those. But the toolkit walks through the structure of each of these different policies, when it was passed, what it looks like, how it's enforced, with a goal of drawing on these examples. And these policies, they differ in a lot of ways, including who they actually cover and what they require. So they're really useful examples. And so the next major section of the report is about designing policies. So it's really thinking about what are the elements that you need to consider when you're thinking about designing an organic waste ban. And the first consideration is really, is this a good fit for my city or state? Why would we want to do this? Is this right for us? And so in thinking about the benefits and possible challenges of an organic waste ban, we look a lot to some of the analyses and studies that have been done in other states. So for example, in Massachusetts, the state here has found that there have been a lot of benefits to the state and to a lot of different stakeholders of developing an organic waste ban in terms of economic value, job creation, as well as emissions reductions, increased food recovery, lots of other benefits. And similar benefits have been seen from examples in other states, as well as from the cost-benefit analysis done on New York's projected policy. At the same time, there are certainly considerations and potential challenges, and there's concern about implementing one of these policies without really being ready to enforce it and ready to take on everything that comes with it. So we walk through a lot of these benefits and potential costs in this toolkit. Some considerations in thinking about whether one of these policies might be right for you is sort of your overall goal. Is it to deal with landfill capacity? Is it to deal with emissions overall? Is it just food? Is it about waste reduction more generally? Your existing infrastructure, do you have enough infrastructure or a plan to develop it, enough to support an actual requirement, requiring people to divert? Political and financial feasibility, what is the context like in your state? What is the budget like? And then ramp up time and stakeholders discussion, which is a really important factor in developing these policies. And do you want to talk about Massachusetts?
Yeah, I think in developing this, we heard this a lot in our stakeholder work, and as an organization, we've heard this a lot as well, of like, how did it actually happen here in Mass, and what was that lead-up process? And so the signals came out starting in 2010, 2011 or so, that the state was planning on implementing this ban, and that it would be in 2014 sometime. And during that period, there was a robust stakeholder engagement process, not just of the regulated community or the potentially regulated community through their association groups and individually, but also the supporting infrastructure, the haulers, compost sites, AD facilities, the other state agencies that would be involved. So there was a very robust process that provided feedback all the way about how it should be structured, how it could be most effective. And that was also coupled with some assistance to get as many generators that were likely subject to the ban in compliance even ahead of the effective date. And I think all of those things combined really led to a very successful launch, where DEP has said this over and over again, that it's one of the first, if only, regulation that's come out of the department that the regulated community had zero pushback when the ban went live. So I think that's a real testament to that process. And New York, as they're exploring a ban, has sort of looked to mirror this, and they've started some stakeholder process that we've also sort of plugged into and provided some testimony to. So there's really something to that sort of model of having a good lead-up time and engaging the people who are going to be involved.
Okay, so we are going to walk now through some of the structural considerations in talking about organic waste bans. And the first is really talking about the overall structure. In our toolkit, we refer broadly to two categories of these laws. One is used to refer to policies that restrict the amount of food waste or organic waste that certain generators can dispose of in landfills or other facilities. So you might hear these called landfill bans, disposal bans, organic waste bans. And examples of those are the law here in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Vermont. And then on the other hand, we talk about policies that require something specific. They require diversion, or they require you to subscribe to some kind of collection or processing service. And this isn't always a clean line, and the distinction and the reasons why you might choose one or the other are highly fact-specific. But some of the considerations might include how you want to go about enforcing these policies and against whom, and what types of diversion you're trying to encourage, or what types of infrastructure you already have in place to support these laws. And again, it's really highly fact-specific, hard to draw a lot of general conclusions, but something that's really important to think about. And the next consideration that we want to talk about is who you actually want to be regulated under these laws. So this is the top row of a table that will be in our toolkit and just compares who is regulated in each of the existing state laws. But you'll see that most of the existing state laws here primarily focus on large commercial businesses, your large retailers, restaurants. Some also cover institutional generators, such as educational institutions, while some actually explicitly exempt certain institutional generators. Of the states that currently have organic waste bans, only Vermont is designed to eventually cover individual residents. So it will go all the way down to the household level. But at the city level, there's several policies that already do this, that require individuals and individual households to divert and source separate their food waste and subscribe to compost collection. There are certain benefits, of course, to covering smaller generators. You're going to capture more of the waste stream. And there are also benefits if you're talking about individuals in terms of like societal norms and cultural benefits and education. At the same time, there are a lot of challenges. I think there are a lot of challenges with the political feasibility, as well as challenges with implementation and developing enough infrastructure to capture this entire stream. And there can also be a lot of contamination and education challenges when it comes to residents as well.
Great. So another consistent theme about across the different strategies is distance exemptions and how it's covered geographically. So two states, Massachusetts and California, both have sort of statewide sort of blanket policies in place, and that this is especially possible. This is a map right here of Massachusetts composting sites, anaerobic digestion sites, and animal feed facilities. And so this is the current map, but even in 2014, there was still quite a few sites. There have been some that have developed, but there was a good general coverage across the state. And so Massachusetts felt very comfortable with having that approach. And in California, it's also universal, but there is also an opportunity in more rural areas to have a waiver in place, and also that this can help to spur more infrastructure growth by having sort of that even playing field across the state and the expectation there. And you contrast that with this model, which is the sort of point with a radius around it, and they're basically saying that this style is saying that you are subject to the law if you're within some distance of an existing either compost site or an anaerobic digestion facility, and that makes you subject to the law, and so this can be very effective when there's not a lot of infrastructure in place, and it helps to spur infrastructure growth. So this is an example of what has happened in Connecticut, where over a period of time, as this is one of the new anaerobic digestion facilities that have come online, this demonstrates what that coverage map ends up looking like, and that there are more entities that end up being subject to the law. It provides some assurance to developers and investors that there could be some feedstock, even though the design of these laws is that it doesn't require the generator to go to the facility that's necessarily there. They can choose where they're going, but it just gives them the threshold that they have to do that. And that's a similar structure to Vermont has a similar approach, and so does Rhode Island. And in Vermont, eventually over time, as they also go down to the generator, to the household level, sort of those lines end up disappearing after a number of years, so that it does become a statewide ban eventually. And so, oops, that's all right. So there are pluses and minuses to each of these approaches, and there's different reasons why you may want to do them. I think that certainly when you have the distance exemptions, that it lessens the burden on the generators of having to incur the cost of transporting material very far, and it also really lowers the burden in terms of the political feasibility of getting a ban through the approval process. So that could be one mechanism of just getting it into the books. I think that one of the challenges that we've seen with this is that some important generators end up not subject to the ban, that just outside that radius is sometimes some very large generators who then don't have the regulatory impetus, or if the compost site is located in a very rural area and all the density of food waste is in a more rural, urban area, then again you're kind of missing where the generation is. So there are pros and cons to these different approaches, but there are those compromises of sort of phasing out over time, like Vermont is doing, or getting more industry sectors involved. And of course, as industry invests in more facility development, then you have a more robust coverage as well. Another thing that is important to point out with this strategy is that that doesn't account for the whole hierarchy. And it's sort of driven on the composting AD kind of side of things, and especially if you're in one of those areas that's not subject to the ban, then there is also not a regulatory impetus to do the prevention and donation sides of things. So that can be challenging to spur those kinds of activities. The New York proposed legislation also had a radius approach into it, but they had a caveat in there that even if you're not within those, if for New York it was 40 miles, you'd still be required to donate. And so they were trying to address that sort of a little bit of a barrier there by having that added piece to their proposed legislation. So those are a few examples of how those are kind of playing out and working in the marketplace. And then we'll move on to thresholds. So this has been another one of the ways where folks are either subject to the ban or not subject to the ban. There's usually a generation quantity. This image here is a screenshot of our food waste estimator tool. We have it broken down by a whole bunch of different industry sectors, just shows supermarkets here as an example. This is on our Recycling Works website. But a lot of different places have different versions of this. We've built one, the NRDC has one, ReFed has one. We've actually talked to all three of those entities. We've sort of compared notes on how to do this because this is one of the key questions. And really whether you're subject to a ban or not, if you're a generator, you want to know how much food waste you might have. So this is a useful tool with or without a ban. But it is one of the main things that helps people determine if they are subject. In Massachusetts, it's at the 1 ton per week, and it doesn't matter, actually, that doesn't necessarily equate to 52 tons over the course of the year. It's a ton in any given week. Many other states have a 2 ton limit, and that can scale down over time. So when the ones that have these generation rates, it's usually that are based on tonnage, this is an important piece of information to know. Other models of who's in from a generation rate or not have other metrics that they're working on. So in California, it's based on volume. So the size of your dumpster helps you determine if you're subject or not within the food industry. And so I think there's a lot of upside to that because it's a very knowable number. The food waste estimator is just that, it's an estimator. It's hard to get exact to the pound data, but it's a knowable number of how many cubic yards of disposal you have going on. You can get that from your hauler, and that can really help you understand. And that also ramps down over time in California. And then in New York City, they're using square footage of the facility as their metric. And so with, I think, the rationale being that the bigger the facility, the more food waste you're going to have. It's also a very knowable number that most folks will know how many square feet their facility has, so it kind of helps you understand whether you're in or not. So again, this is a range of strategies to help kind of get around how much food waste you have, a few different ways of looking at that. And this is something that you'd want to look at this and maybe even other models for how to think about what makes sense for if you're considering a ban.
So I think we're going to pause here for a moment and hopefully get some of your voices involved as well. So I think we just wanted to take a couple minutes and hear from a few of you about whether you've seen any of these structural considerations play out in practice, if there are particular factors that would or did support or pose a challenge for your business or your service, or if you're a regulator, if you've seen examples of these play out that you think would help illustrate the points that we're trying to make in this chapter of the toolkit. So I think we can take a couple if people have ideas. And the mic's coming to you.
So I used some of your information on the generation side in conjunction with AB 1826 in California. So I took a hauler's accounts of all those bins and tried to generate the numbers that were there so they could figure out what was their category 1, 2, 3, and 4 generators, and then went to the field and audited it. And we found about 50% of the volume it projected was what we found in the bin. So we did see some differences on the estimation to what was in the field. The challenge was when we expected to look at the number of generators in tons, the point you raised where you think as you go smaller, you'd get a whole bunch more tons. We actually found the chart the other way. It was few generators created a lot, where a lot of generators created very little. So you were chasing dollars and then chasing pennies. And I didn't expect the data to come back that way when we started actually digging into account by account. So I just wanted to share taking some of your information and using it in the field we've been doing and just some of what we found out.
That's a great piece of feedback. I think one of the things that we've seen in using the tool, and we, even in our own work day-to-day of giving technical assistance to generators, use the tool ourselves, and there's a number of different types of metrics within the tool. For a hospital, for example, it's number of meals served, plus number of beds, plus the size of your dumpster or compactor. And the more of those different factors you can have for a given entity that you're working with, the closer and closer we find that you can get to a number you can stand behind. It's really hard if you're just using one of the different types of metrics you can choose from. So if you are using that tool or using it as a reference, I would really recommend trying to use a number of strategies there to narrow in on a closer to accurate number. Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, similar to what the gentleman was just talking about. With our grind to energy system, we've tried to estimate for potential customers what their generation rate is. The problem is they don't know. Many of them are charged based upon frequency of pickup and a certain volume of container. So they may have a 64-yard container and it's picked up 6 times a week or whatever. The problem is not all of them are full, or perhaps they overfill. And at the end of the day, the haulers has no best interest in providing a good number because they would love to charge them as much as they can. And unfortunately, this means that the generators really don't know how much they're generating.
I think that there's a lot of reality there that for a lot of generators, it's a bill that they pay monthly, kind of to your point, and don't spend a lot more time thinking about this. And so that, again, I think will just point to the more different ways you can look at it, the closer you are going to get to a number. One, in this case, of just like the volume of the container may not tell you everything, especially if it's not full or, as you say, overfull. So having other factors to compare, not just that one factor, is going to help go a long way to get closer to a real number. And then just observing and spending some time actually watching what's going on is really critical to kind of truth out where it's going to be. Any others?
Oh, we can take one more. No, right there.
So I'm from the Portland, Oregon metropolitan region, and in about 3 weeks, we're about to take a mandatory policy to our governing body there, coupled with a disposal ban. So we're doing both. The one thing I wanted to reflect on was the distance maps that you put up about where is everyone required to do this. So our area is 3 counties and 24 cities, and initially we were going to waive some areas from implementation because they were a little too distant to available transfer facilities. Our policymakers and businesses didn't like that because many of these businesses had many branches throughout the region. And their desire was a consistent program throughout the entire region so they could train their employees and have a program that was consistent. Our policymakers didn't like it because it exempted some of the largest generators. And so our tonnage projections and our desire to get this material out of the waste stream was quite lowered. So our approach is actually, we're doing a temporary distance to services payment. So we're actually compensating the haulers for their time on the road. And we've done this GIS mapping, we've done a tremendous amount of kind of zoning, you know, where would they have gone otherwise if it was garbage, how much extra time on the road, how many dollars per minute is that? And so we're going to compensate them for that cost for the first 5 years of the program. And we're rolling the program out in stages of phases, beginning with businesses that generate 1,000 pounds per week or more. Some of this is going to be kind of expensive. If we make no changes to the program, we have no transfer capacity added during those 5 years, it's going to be about $2 million worth of payments. So we've taken a little bit of a different approach, mostly to make it seamless for businesses and to satisfy our policymakers who wanted a truly regional program.
So can I ask a follow-up question on that? So if new capacity comes online, will those sort of distance payments go away?
Yes, they will. We're building a database. We actually have a database now that tracks. We've actually sampled a whole bunch of different databases and used a lot of data from around the country. So we used the California data on generation by sector. We have our own calculator. We're doing it by FTE, by NAICS codes. And we've mapped out every single business in our region, their size, the number of FTE, how much we expect they'll generate. We take that total generation and cut it in half because our expectation is we're going to get about 50% of what they generate. That's our goal. If new transfer capacity comes online, we have the ability to immediately take those businesses out of the payment zone. So we know exactly where our hauler franchise boundaries are, which businesses are there, how big they are, what we expect they generate, when they're coming into the program phased in, beginning March 2020 through September 2022. So we've really kind of mapped out what we expect to see. And we've also done a lot of projections about what we expect to see in the way of tonnage, which is one thing. When we looked around the country, I made a lot of phone calls. A lot of these programs did no projections about what they expected to capture. And it's like, how do you know how to handle it if you don't know what you're going to expect to get? So that was a surprise to us.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
Okay. So I think in the interest of time, we are going to move on to our next section. So our next section of the toolkit is really about challenges and barriers, but also possible solutions to these challenges. And we've set these challenges into a couple of large categories. So I'm going to talk about the first one, which is political feasibility and political considerations. This is obviously something that comes up when you're talking about any kind of new policy. But here we're thinking both about challenges to passing an organic waste ban and what some of the considerations and compromises there might be, and then also the ongoing political considerations, particularly when a new requirement comes online as scheduled or when there's thoughts about expanding existing requirements. So you'll see here some of the headlines, just some of the articles over the past couple months of things that have been coming up in a couple cities and states. But I think one example that illustrates really well the types of compromises and sort of evolution of the process that happens when you're trying to pass one of these policies is New York State. They've been trying to pass an organic waste ban for several years now. And if you compare the language of the proposed text in each year, you start to see some changes that really appear to be targeted at some of the concerns raised by stakeholders in the previous years. So for example, Lorenzo talked about the distance exemption in New York. It used to be 50 miles in the previous version. In this full year 2019 proposed law, it was down to 40 miles in order to, in theory, reduce some of the hardship on generators to not have them travel as far. Similarly, the hardship waiver that was included in the previous version of the law was made much more clear to make it clear that there's the possibility of exemption for generators for whom this would be a real burden. So you can really see attempts to cater to different stakeholder groups and make this more appealing to everyone. And then in terms of thinking about some of the challenges that might be continuing as these policies evolve and expand as scheduled, this past year, New York City proposed a rule to expand the number and types of generators, the types of businesses that would be covered under its organic waste ban, and saw a lot of pushback from haulers and food service companies expressing concerns about processing capacity, concerns about cost, and also just general concerns about insufficient consultation and other factors. That expansion did end up coming online, but it was really, there was a lot of opposition there. And then similarly in Vermont, there's been a lot of opposition to some of the scheduled expansions of this law, particularly around requirements on haulers to provide separate compost collection services. There have been a lot of haulers opposing this provision because of the increased costs on them and the fact that maybe in rural areas it's not efficient or feasible for them to be offering this additional service. They won't be able to compete anymore because they can't, especially the smaller haulers will not be able to afford the equipment costs. And because of this pushback, the effective date for this requirement was actually pushed back a year, and there have also been bills introduced to get rid of this, this provision entirely. So it's definitely not a process that's ever done, I think, is one of the morals of the story, and also just what Lorenzo was talking about before, which is the importance of stakeholder involvement at every stage of the process, and having that be an ongoing thing.
So another consistent barrier that has come up over time is the infrastructure piece, which we've touched on in a couple different ways, but this is definitely something that's always under consideration when looking at one of these pieces of policy. And so I think in most places, certainly in the Northeast, when we've looked at these, when you add up the total number of tons that are of food waste that exist in the waste stream and the total amount of processing capacity at compost sites or anaerobic digestion facilities, there's typically a gap. And so that's one of the questions that always comes up, and how do you think about that? And so, and also then just defining infrastructure is also really important. So when there's a lack of it, there's this chicken or egg problem that ends up happening. You need generators who are going to divert material. You need composting sites or anaerobic digestion sites, the processors that are going to have them, and you also need the haulers that are going to move the material around. All three of those are really necessary, and it becomes this chicken or egg issue of who's going to kind of jump in and get going first to be able to start to build the infrastructure and get more capacity going. And so that's a constant struggle, but it's also part of the strategic plan behind some of these bans, like we've already talked about with Connecticut and Rhode Island, with those distance exemptions, that the structure of the ban can also help to lower some of those barriers and get those actors to kind of collaborate and work together to kind of get over the hurdles, to get those investments going and get infrastructure starting to build. And there's a number of ways where this is happening, and ways where some of the investments are coming from the public sector outside of some of the worlds where at least us from the sort of solid waste lens are used to. So for anaerobic digestion development, for example, there are the renewable energy arms of state agencies that are helping contribute to this. In Massachusetts, it's the Clean Energy Center. In Connecticut, there's the Green Bank, and there are other similar entities in other states that are contributing to the development of anaerobic digestion because of the renewable energy side of things. Or similarly, the utility companies that have energy efficiency goals, there's the sort of cogeneration part of this, that they're also investing in anaerobic digestion development at standalone facilities, but even specifically at wastewater treatment facilities that have this and this capacity and can add on the ability to take that. So those are some places where public funds are coming in to help develop infrastructure on that side of things. And then it's also important to think about the whole hierarchy that we'll kind of get into here in a second. That there's a number of different types of policies that kind of support all of this. So one kind is at the city level. The city of Philadelphia has a zero waste plan in place, and they're working on how to implement that across the city at the residential level, at the municipal level, and at the commercial level. And we're really fortunate to be working with the city, with the support of the Clenille Foundation, to help the city figure out how to address some of this. And they are seeing some infrastructure barriers, one of which they're willing to put some city-owned land out there to possibly build a compost site that would be privately operated, because there is a lack of capacity in this area. So that's one of the things that the city is exploring through that kind of a mechanism. We've already talked a little bit about Connecticut's model with the radiuses. That's one way that they've designed it that's helping spur more growth. And they're also looking, now that they've gotten at least one facility on board, they're helping to streamline the permitting process for siting AD facilities, which is also can be quite challenging because there's a number of different agencies that oversee that. And then there's the intersection with the sort of food system space, where Rhode Island has a ban in place, but they've also got a very active food systems group, and their Sue Anderbaugh, who will be also speaking here tomorrow. We're working quite a bit in Rhode Island. They've put out their Relish Roadie report, which is their plan, which has identified wasted food as a top 5 strategy to strengthen their food system. And they know that they need more infrastructure there, so it's really tied together for that. So these are just a couple of different examples of how different types of policies and different aspects of state and local government are helping to support infrastructure growth. And finally, in thinking about infrastructure, as I said, the whole hierarchy is really important. That prevention is infrastructure, so is donation, and so is sort of the lower parts and the hauling piece across this hierarchy. I think that one of my favorite quotes from John Fisher here at Mass DEP has been, a ton of prevention is a ton of new capacity that's come on board. And that's really, really important. And similarly, when I was at the Biocycle conference this spring, I was on a panel with Kyle Pogue and a bunch of others from California who were thinking about how are we going to build more infrastructure, build more facilities, but there's also this donation requirement. And so considering the tonnage that's going to be pulled out and going to donation, and how much can we maximize prevention is also important from an investment perspective for infrastructure, so that these facilities are appropriately sized for the tonnage that will actually be food scraps that are appropriate for composting or anaerobic digestion. And so these are different ways where that gap between the existing capacity and what's out there for generation can be met in a creative range of different strategies through these kind of policy actions and private and public interactions. I think we're going to stop here for some questions too.
That's right. Yes, we're going to stop for a couple questions. I think we wanted to get a sense from you in talking about political considerations, and we're talking about stakeholders. Like, what are the stakeholders that really need to be involved here? Are there stakeholders that you've seen in your processes that should be involved that aren't at the table, and how do we think about getting those groups at the table to make these policies function better?
I can talk louder. Hi everyone, Meredith Denberg-Ficarelli from New York City. New York City is looking towards a zoning or franchising policy, essentially changing what's currently an open market for commercial waste collection into one that's zoned by geography. They went through a stakeholder engagement process. They hired 2 different consulting teams, one that was focused on the analysis of the data that they were provided by the commercial waste haulers, and the other was focused entirely on stakeholder engagement. I run a company in the city that helps set up composting recycling operations. There are a lot of small entrepreneurial ventures. Most of them are actually run by either minorities or women or both of those. In the food rescue space, zero waste space, looking at small consulting operations, None of these businesses were reached out to in the stakeholder engagement process. The only people that, the only organizations that were at the table because they were asked to be at the table were the large industry groups. So the Restaurant Association, the Hotel Association, Real Estate Board. And we had to bring ourselves to the table and present a lot of the things that we think need to be considered in the development of this new commercial zoning structure. Things like diversion goals, things like funds coming out of the franchising fees that can go towards food rescue, which is something that's happening in LA. Looking at waste auditing, they're talking about setting diversion goals and understanding baselines, but there was no discussion of how they were gonna get those things. And we presented this information to the New York City Department of Sanitation, and it was all novel to them. So if they're hiring people to do stakeholder engagement and they're not talking to the people that are actually on the ground doing the work, there's something seriously wrong, and whatever policies they're building are going to fall short of actually getting anything done. I guess that wasn't really a question. It's an experience. I'm wondering, how can cities, if they are going into the action of doing stakeholder engagement, how can they hire better teams or do a fuller job of engaging with the organizations that are already doing the work on the ground?
We asked a question and we got a question back. We let you take this one with the stakeholder process.
All right. I would say that just reflecting on having been so involved in the Massachusetts process, one, there was a pretty long ramp-up time that was allowed. It was a not a short amount of time. It was a couple of years, and it was seen as an iterative process that it wasn't a one and done. The one round of stakeholder engagement led to, okay, we probably need to reach out to these few other types of stakeholders that are not currently in the fold, and one would lead to another, and so it was both had a lot of elapsed time, and it was that iterative process that helped. I don't know if that's an answer or not. That's just a reflection on what happened here that seemed to be pretty successful. But I think, to your point, being comprehensive and very, very inclusive is very important. That can lead to that sort of consensus feeling at the end when you actually finally do have the policy, whatever it might be.
You have a mic coming right behind you.
I think a bit of a related question from me would be whether you guys have seen in assessments of processing capacity, whether community scale operations have been taken into account in those projections. Knowing that New York City in particular has such an incredible wealth of community scale processors, and whether facilitated by the city or totally independently, that does make up, I would assume, a sizable portion, even though obviously with such a dense city, incredible quantities of processing capacity would be critical and definitely require lots of commercial scale as well.
At least from Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts perspective, being that they are completely focused on the commercial sector and larger generators within the commercial sector, I don't believe it went down to the sort of community scale, because they're not likely to be an outlet for that material at that scale. They are a very important part of the overall infrastructure, and I think there are a lot of different niches for different scales and different technology types to serve the marketplace at large. But in the context of those particular bands and that process, it didn't really go down to the community scale that I know of because of the threshold amounts, basically.
I think for the sake of time, we might move on to the next section. I think this is you again.
Okay. So next thing we're going to talk about here a little is education and technical assistance work. There are a number of different pieces of policy and strategies that can be employed that are not just like the ban itself, and that's sort of, this whole next section is going to be those kinds of strategies. So we'll talk first here about technical assistance. We see that any one of these pieces can happen on their own and do happen on their own, but we're seeing the fastest growth, marketplace change, largest levels of economic activity, and tonnage diversion when all of them are working together in concert. I'm going to talk a little bit about the technical assistance piece because that's what we do in our day job every day. But first, I'll give a couple different examples. One is San Francisco has a model where the city itself, city employees are doing the engagement of the business community and providing the technical assistance to help them implement their programs. San Francisco is widely seen as a leader. It's very effective. They're doing a very good job, and that is definitely one model that can work. And having the trusted entity of the local government engage can be a very, very good strategy, and certainly for San Francisco has worked really, really well. The model that Massachusetts has used has had us involved as a nonprofit. We're not a hauler or a processor or a composter or a food rescue organization, but our job is to really get to know all of those entities really, really well, what they do, their strengths, and then armed with that information, go out and engage the generator community and provide them with the assistance that they need to implement programs. And I think the design that the Massachusetts DEP had in working with our organization, CET, to start this up is that one was it's decoupling the regulatory agency and the government authority from the technical assistance provider. So I think that's been one strong piece of that. And again, being that nonprofit who doesn't have a stake in the game, because we're not any of those entities that provide the services directly, we don't have a stake in which choice the generator we're working with makes. We just want to make sure that they're not throwing this in the trash and helping them get there. And of course, anytime you can provide this type of assistance for free to businesses, that's always a huge bonus as well. So that strategy has been working really, really well here. And the approach that we're using when we're providing this type of technical assistance, I think, is also quite important. That we're not there to dictate which way they should go. We really, again, give them these range of opportunities that they could use and meet them where they are by just listening and understanding what their priorities are and giving them a range of options that might work for them so that they can make a good, informed business decision. At the end of the day, this is a business for them, and we recognize very much that while diverting food waste is our core business, it's not likely their core business, and that we see ourselves as there to help them stay focused on getting their restaurant patron to enjoy their meal and come back for another one while they implement these changes as efficiently and effectively as possible, because we've helped hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of others just like them do this. And so that approach has kind of gotten us into a place where we're well trusted and can kind of implement the changes fairly quickly and efficiently. And when we've done this, a couple of examples are the Big Y Foods, which I want to share because we did this work with them starting a couple of decades ago, so far before there was a regulatory impetus, but we were providing the same kind of technical assistance. And then as the regulations came in place, we helped them make sure their programs are good and robust. And we love to share that they're doing an excellent job at prevention. They're doing lots with food donation, and most recently adding on produce and meats, so they're getting like the highly nutritious foods for donation, and doing a lot of recycling and composting, which is about 16,000 tons of material getting diverted from disposal, and about a $3 million boost to the bottom line. So those are numbers that kind of make the corporate folks raise eyebrows and make anybody pretty excited about that. And they have about 70 stores across a couple of different states. And then at a smaller scale, there's the Sheraton Hotel at the Bradley International Airport in Connecticut, where we helped the restaurant and the Starbucks and the different entities within the hotel start up diversion programs, and they're saving a couple $1,000s a year. And on our Wasted Food Solutions website, CET's Wasted Food Solutions website right down here, you can see a video case study of this, and you can hear the manager say it in his own words of how effective this has been for him. Just one last example that the technical assistance focus on the generators is important, but we've also seen that it's important to have technical assistance provided to the compost site operators as well. And so on Martha's Vineyard, even here in Massachusetts, Martha Vineyard is an island off the southern coast of the state here, where there's a lot of infrastructure already in Massachusetts, but there are places where it was less developed. And so we have a big collaboration going with lots of different entities, including Island Grown. The Fink Family Foundation has been generously supporting this and supporting our organization, which we're very thankful for, and the state agencies that are involved, and lots of other stakeholders on the island, where we modeled our generator technical assistance with Sophie Abrams from Island Grown, so she could see how we train restaurant owners to do this. That also led to more composting activity and more captured tonnage over time, because as she was replicating that, and then that meant that we needed more capacity for dealing with the food waste, and so we provided consultants to help operate the compost sites well, so that they could process this material, and now they're at a stage where they need to go even to the next step further, or how are they going to scale that even further, because this is still a fairly small amount of tons, and there's a lot more that can happen. But this is an example of how, when there's a collaboration of lots of different stakeholders, the public sector, nonprofits, other organizations, all collaborating together, how it can go from like single-digit tons to hundreds of tons, and then you scale out to the state of Massachusetts, who've been doing this. This goes to tens of thousands of tons, millions of dollars of economic activity, and hundreds of jobs. Really a robust marketplace for this type of activity when all of those pieces are working together. And I think that does it for that. I'll turn it over to Katie again.
Great. So I'm going to talk really quickly in the hopes of leaving some time for questions, but I'm just going to talk briefly about a couple of the other policies and programs that we talk about in this last section on these ancillary and supporting programs in our toolkit. So one of the biggest things that we think can be done on the policy side, both as a standalone option and in conjunction with an organic waste ban, has to do with permitting for facilities such as compost and anaerobic digestion facilities. Just because the costs and time associated with acquiring a permit can be really significant and can be a huge barrier to developing infrastructure. We've seen several states that have revised their permitting structures over the past several years to facilitate the development of smaller compost NAD facilities, and also the ability to scale up. So one example is New York. In 2017, New York's Department of Environmental Conservation revised its permitting structures to create a tiered system. So the smallest or lowest risk, I guess, facilities have fewer regulatory requirements. There's a middle tier, and then the largest facilities have to go through the full set of regulations. And so you can see some of this on this chart with the 3 different tiers. But the idea was really to make it easier for smaller facilities to enter the marketplace and for them to eventually scale up. Rhode Island also developed a 3-tier system right as it was right as its organic waste bans became effective, in order to support the necessary infrastructure needed for the ban. They had very little when this organic waste ban passed. And at the same time, it also developed its first regulations for permitting anaerobic digestion facilities to make the process more clear. In particular, for AD, permitting can be really difficult. It can go through a lot of different departments and just can be really burdensome. So cities and states can also think about streamlining application processes specifically for anaerobic digestion facilities, and that's something that has happened here in Massachusetts with the general permit application. Somewhat related to permitting, just to talk briefly about zoning, this can also be a real issue at the local level, because this can determine whether a facility can be sited anywhere near a larger population center that has these large generators. And so if you can't have a facility sited there and you have a distance exemption, for example, all of a sudden a lot of your big generators might not be covered. One barrier is that compost facilities often fall within a larger category of waste management activities, which can be really heavily zoned. So there are some examples of cities and municipalities who have made it easier to zone these facilities by either defining a separate activity for composting, and also by differentiating between different sizes of compost facilities or different sizes of compost activity. So one example is here in Boston. Article 89 was an urban agriculture regulation, but it included regulations defining a separate activity for composting, and there are different requirements if composting is what's called a primary use versus an accessory use, which has to do with how much of it is happening on your land. And the last area I'm going to talk about really quickly is pay-as-you-throw. You might also hear about this talked about as unit-based pricing, variable rate pricing, a variety of other terms. But the basic idea here is that you're getting charged by the amount of trash you're producing. So this can be done by using different bags, different sized carts. There are all kinds of systems for it. But the idea is that if you have to pay more to throw out more trash, you're going to reduce the amount you're producing, and you're going to compost and recycle more in order to divert that from your trash bin. And so this can be really effective both as a standalone method or in conjunction with an organic waste ban. So one example is in Vermont, where actually as part of their universal recycling law, every county was required to implement a pay-as-you-throw system, and I believe they were at something like 99% compliance. The compliance was really high. And so I guess one note on this is just that we talk about pay-as-you-throw a lot in the residential context, but this is also basically what happens in the business context already. The more you produce, you have a bigger dumpster, you're probably going to pay more. But it's something that at the residential level has the opportunity to create a big impact. And some data on this comes from well, this is pulled from research being done in Minneapolis, where they're thinking about their zero waste plan, but they were really looking at other examples of pay-as-you-throw and the outcomes. And it really illustrates that if you have a significant differential between the largest and smallest cart options or whatever, however else you're differentiating in prices, fewer people are going to start using the largest, or fewer people are going to use the largest carts. And so it really has the potential to reduce waste at the consumer level. So with that, I think we're going to wrap up. We have about 5 minutes. I think to conclude, we just want to talk a little bit about the next steps and why we think this is so timely. I think on our end, we're seeing a lot of progress at the state level. Part of the impetus behind this toolkit was just that we're here in New England and we're seeing this happen all around us, and we're getting a lot of questions about it. And beyond the state and local level, we're seeing some interest at the federal level too in terms of what can they do to support this. The most recent Senate Farm Bill draft actually included some funding for composting plans, so really at the municipal level, so really thinking about supporting these policies. I know you had some other examples.
Yeah, I think if in the waste world, there's a real issue right now with something called National Sword, where most of our recyclables are going to China, and there's been some policy there where because of the contamination levels in a lot of the recyclables coming out of the U.S., they're either stopping or really significantly prohibiting materials from going over. And one of the most significant contaminants is food waste. And so by addressing this issue, we can, at least in theory, really improve the quality of the recyclables and help on that front. And I think that we definitely recognize in putting this together that not everywhere is going to be able to do a ban, and that that there are all these other complementing pieces of policy and regulation that are really, really important, and the technical assistance piece helps drive a lot of that. And so it's not an all or nothing. You can kind of patchwork these things together to be really effective. So we're hoping that the toolkit will help kind of look across the spectrum of all the different kind of levers that you can pull that make a big difference. So that's, I think, another important point. I just also want to make sure to thank Coria Manzel on our team, who's really done a lot to help put this together. And I really appreciate all of her help and support. And your team, of course, who Katie has been great to work with. We really appreciate the collaboration and all the partnership on this project.
Yeah, definitely. It's been great to work with CET, and I know a lot of people in this room as well we've talked to in the process of writing this toolkit and may talk to again. So we're really appreciative for all the feedback and input. We're going to open it up for a couple questions. One thing I just want to note, though, is we do have copies of the executive summary of the toolkit. It's still in draft form. But if you're interested in taking a look, you can come up and grab a copy afterwards. And now that you're at the conference, you'll be on our mailing list, so you'll hear when the toolkit is released this fall. But yeah, does anyone have any questions?
Thank you. My name is Troels Wenzel. I'm with the Danish Embassy here in Washington, D.C. And now you talk, first of all, congratulations on this. Is very interesting, and we are looking very much into what is happening over here in the US. We have seen in Denmark that what happens on farms can also be used in, for instance, for biogas. So, you know, there's a lot of organic matter on a farm that you can't sell or anything, so manure or straws or whatever. Is there any interest in using that in some of these composting or biogas facilities? Not the manure, but in the composting. And we would love to share some of the lessons that we have learned. Some we have learned the hard way, some we have learned maybe a little more easy. And we have some interesting perspectives and companies that are looking into this. Also companies that would be willing to invest over here in biogas. Thank you.
Sure. There are a number of anaerobic digestion facilities that are co-located on dairy farms right now. So they're taking the manure and adding slurried food waste. So that's one example. Then there are lots of compost sites that are on various types of agricultural lands that are incorporating not only the on-farm materials, but also off-farm, like food scraps, and also landscaping materials and other types. I believe there's at least 1 or 2 dry AD systems in development that have at least the potential to do that, and it might even be a Danish technology provider that's on that. I can't remember exactly the technology provider. So there are a few examples, but I would love to hear more about what you have in mind, and happy to talk afterwards. There's another.
Hi, I'm with the City of Austin, and in talking about your work in Massachusetts and your company providing technical assistance to properties that are required to comply, what we do in Austin, the city is providing all of the technical assistance as well as doing all of the enforcement of the ordinance. We're in our final phase. We have a universal recycling ordinance which requires multifamily and commercial properties to have recycling capacity, and if there's a businesses with a food service permit are required to divert organic material. And so in that final phase, we're ramping up, and I think we're adding 6,000 properties. We have a really small team of, I think it's between 6 and 8 staffers that are doing all of that. And so we're at a real pinch point as far as just the ability for our staff, our existing staffing, to be able to consult with those businesses and handle all of the enforcement. So my specific question to you is, doing this on behalf of the regulatory body, are you being compensated by the businesses or from the regulatory agency, or neither, and how that works?
We do this in a blend of different ways. In Massachusetts specifically, it is the state agency that's funding us.
Okay.
But we're doing similar work in several of the other Northeast states through a blend of state and federal and foundation support. But we have also done this work on a fee-for-service basis. So how it gets funded has been a mix of things, and it sort of depends on where we are and what the level of resources that are available to get this work done. So it's a mix.
Yeah, and we've contracted out with some folks to help us with education and assistance. So it's still they're operating on behalf of the city. And there are some consulting firms that have popped up to do this sort of technical assistance, but it's free to come to the city and get the technical assistance. So we're just kind of at a pinch point as we are entering our last year of rollout. So.
Well, I'd be happy to talk to you about some strategy because we can't get to every single business, but there are definitely some things that we're doing. I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards about that.
So I think we actually need to wrap up as the next plenary is going to get started in here shortly. But we'll be around if people have additional questions, and we are going to, I think, put the executive summaries on the literature table so that the next plenary can get set up and we're not blocking them. But you should feel free to grab one on the way out later this evening or after the session.
Thank you.
Thank you.